Once an engine called Thomas the Train was renowned through a show in his name. But through new ownership, his dignity slipped, and today he just isn't the same. Well, with that mediocre limerick, you can guess what the topic of today's video will be. We've had the famous televised version of the Reverend Audrey's Little Blue Tank engine known to us for about 40 years now. As with anything that's been around that long, changes are bound to occur, and Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends has undergone many of them over the years, some of which have not been for the best. The Thomas we have now hardly resembles the one we had during the 80s. How did this happen? What's caused Thomas to go from an enjoyable and memorable character to being a flat and pandering cash grab? The only way to figure that out is to examine his television career. Let's say we ride those rails together. The most popular version of Thomas the Tank Engine began his life on screen in 1984. Now, this wasn't the first time the Reverend Audrey's books had been adapted for the small screen. Attempts to bring these talking trains to life were made as early as 1953, but they were all unsuccessful. The televised Thomas we know and love came into existence through the efforts of a woman named Britt David. When putting together a documentary about steam engines, she discovered the Railway series books and became enamored by them. She wanted to give the stories new life on the small screen. It took a lot of work on Britt David's part to get the series off the ground, and her efforts paid off. Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends was a runaway success. The combination of Britt David's love for the original books, David Mitten's direction, and Ringo Starr's narration really helped to sell these lovable engines to the masses. The stories from the first two seasons were lifted directly from 16 of the Reverend Audrey's books, and one written by his son Christopher specifically for the show. I think these seasons represent the absolute pinnacle for the show in terms of quality, especially the second season with its dramatic and action-packed storylines. It was lauded enough to be nominated twice for a BAFTA award. Yes, the praise in Great Britain was high, but international success was still something Thomas had yet to achieve. In the US, where the largest entertainment marketplace resided, Thomas and the other Railway series characters were virtually unknown. This was something that Britt David wanted to change. One small issue was that at this time, the episodes of Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends ran for only about 5 minutes each. Stricter broadcasting schedules in the US meant that there needed to be a half-hour program that would incorporate the episodes in some way. Enter Shining Time Station. Shining Time Station was a joint effort between Britt David and American producer Rick Siggelkow, which aired on PBS from 1989 to 1993. The series puts us into a fictional railroad station where many colorful and charming characters work, including one Mr. Conductor. This small man, played by Ringo Starr in the first season and by George Carlin for the remainder of its run, was the source of the stories about Thomas and his friends. Usually he would tell these stories to impart lessons to the children who visited, or in some cases to the staff at Shining Time. This was how Thomas made his presence known to the kids of America. Now, before the episodes could be run on US television, changes had to be made. Of course, the terminology was one such change. Trucks became freight cars, the guard became the conductor, and because it wasn't considered appropriate to refer to someone by their weight, the Fat Controller went by his real name of Sir Topham Hatt. Dialogue also had to be changed sometimes to lighten the tone of the show a little bit.
He wondered if he would ever be allowed to pull trains again. But I think he deserved his punishment. Don't you?
How long do you think Henry will stay in the tunnel before he overcomes his fear of the rain and decides to journey out again?
Another change that I wasn't aware of until I started researching for this video was the episodes that featured Daisy, the diesel rail car, were not broadcast on the series. Rick Siggelkow thought that her design looked a bit too stereotypical and sexist. This is also why she didn't appear in the third season of the show. I guess I understand why he said that, but it is a bit disappointing that she didn't appear in many episodes from the model era of the series. Nevertheless, Shining Time Station was a massive success. The Reverend Audrey's famous engines were now being enjoyed by children all over the world, as the series made its way to Japan and elsewhere. Toys and videotapes were in high demand, and you began to see Thomas almost everywhere. Carl Sagan even mentions the series in his book A Pale Blue Dot.
In the Thomas the Tank Engine series, we even have anthropomorphic locomotives and railway cars, charmingly portrayed. No matter what we're thinking about, animate or inanimate, we tend to invest it with human traits.
With Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends targeting a more international audience, the third season of the show, which was being produced concurrently with Shining Time Station, was retooled to have a broader appeal. A few big changes came into play here, the most notable being the change of narrator. After the first season of Shining Time Station, Ringo Starr left Thomas the Tank Engine behind and went back to his music career. The role of Mr. Conductor went to George Carlin, and he proved to be quite a bit more popular in the role than Ringo did, believe it or not. The original UK dubs of the series had Michael Angelis in the role of narrator, a role which he would hold for close to 25 years. These two men gave the series a distinctly new spark of life with their voice work for the stories, some of which weren't actually Audrey-penned material. Yes, that was another big change with this season. Instead of adapting all the episodes from the Railway series books, Season 3 saw Britt Allcroft and David Mitton adopting a bit of a mixed mode for the adaptations. Half the episodes from Season 3 were taken from the original books, but the other half were taken from the Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends magazine. Their reasons for doing this were because, one, most of the stories that had not yet been adapted were ones about the narrow gauge engines, who were smaller than Thomas and his comrades on the standard gauge. Making models of them would be considerably more expensive and take more time than they had for production. The other reason was because, well, who do you think the main star of the show is? Sir Topham Hatt? Nope. They wanted more stories that involved Thomas, and not many of the unadapted Railway series stories did. Thomas not only got more of his own stories, but he began to appear in the Railway series adaptations where he wasn't originally featured. These changes caused the Reverend Audrey's opinion of the show to sour. He complained about the adaptations of his stories crane-shunting Thomas into places where he wouldn't have appeared normally, and he criticized the adaptations from the magazine stories for their lack of realism. The Reverend Audrey's stories always had a firm basis in reality. He took inspiration from real events that happened on railways around the world, and sometimes from his own experiences. He was able to pen over 100 stories, but when he could no longer come up with any new ideas in this fashion, he retired. Now, it's good for a fictional universe to have a realistic basis in order to have a familiar setup for the audience. However, rigid realism can only get you so far where stories are concerned. Works of fiction have long been known to stretch the rules of reality, as that's sometimes what's needed in order to have a more exciting story. I mean, would anyone have wanted to watch Star Trek if the USS Enterprise had to obey the laws of physics and couldn't go anywhere near the speed of light? Me neither. Additionally, television is able to showcase more action and dynamics than picture books can, and producers like being able to utilize those benefits to their full potential. There had been quite a few action-packed episodes of the show lifted from the pages of the Railway series, but what had not yet been adapted would have either been too expensive to make at this point, as I said earlier, or not dynamic enough. In some cases, the stories from the Railway series got a bit repetitive by showcasing incidents we'd already seen before, so it was only natural for Britt Allcroft and the others behind the show to look for inspiration elsewhere. The stories that weren't the Reverend Audrey's may not have had the same authenticity, but they were still entertaining. Henry's Forest, despite being criticized by the Reverend for its lack of realism, does show a different side to Henry's character and gives him a bit more depth. Other non-Audrey stories, like Trust Thomas or Percy James and The Fruitful Day, were both lively and amusing, making them all the more appealing to viewers. Of course, the episodes that did have their basis in the Reverend Audrey's books were praiseworthy as well, especially the dramatic episode Escape, hailed as one of the greatest of the show. In my opinion, there was a lot more to enjoy about the third season than there was to despise. Though I guess you could say that it was where the seeds were sown for Thomas's decline in quality. The following season saw the showrunners return to the Reverend stories for adaptations again. This is where we finally got to see Skarloey, Rheneas, Rusty, and all the other narrow-gauge engines in model form for the first time, as well as a few others that had appeared in the books. It still kept the same spirit as the previous season, but showcased the adapted stories very well. It was a good return to form, but it was the last full season to use the Railway series as source material. Additionally, it was the last season produced during the Reverend Audrey's lifetime. After his death in 1997, Britt Allcroft and David Mitton set about producing a full season featuring stories of their own creation, with some inspiration coming from the magazines again. Season 5 captured an abundance of different tones, from action-packed to haunting to comical, and there were a couple charming tales focused on Sir Topham Hatt. Quite a nice touch there, giving focus to characters who didn't get much of it beforehand. This really gives us a more well-rounded perspective of the island's inhabitants. This season seemed to be pretty accident-heavy. Watching through it, I think there were only about half a dozen episodes that didn't involve some kind of crash. Some of the setups were a bit silly, though. Like in the episode Toby and the Flood. Why would you put tracks on a dam, especially one that's barely as wide as Toby? This is what kind of causes this season to fall slightly short of the previous ones in terms of quality. I know I said that the original stories from Season 3 weren't as authentic as the ones that the Reverend wrote, but they seemed at least plausible. I mean, I could see something like this happening on a real railway somewhere. I don't think it's possible for an engine to be buried by an avalanche and then create an igloo with the heat from their engine. Yes, they really say that the heat from Skarloey's engine did that. Still, I don't want to be too hard on this season, as it was still top-tier quality material. More absurdity is yet to come, though. Now we've got a movie on our hands. The first, and so far the only theatrical film to center around Thomas the Tank Engine and friends, arrived a couple years after Season 5, in the form of 2000's Thomas and the Magic Railroad. This film incorporated elements from both Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends and Shining Time Station. Virtually all of the cast from Shining Time Station were different, including Mr. Conductor, played here by Alec Baldwin, who was narrating the show for the US at this time. The movie revolves around the search for an engine named Lady, who supplies all the magic to the island, and to Mr. Conductor, whose supply of magic gold dust is running seriously low. The villainous Diesel 10 wants to destroy her and all the other steam engines, along with the magic Lady supplies. Thomas and his friends, along with a young girl named Lily and Mr. Conductor's lazy cousin, must find a way to get Lady running again and keep Diesel 10 from destroying all the magic. Yeah, it's a bit of a convoluted and confusing storyline. Evidently, this movie was heavily rewritten after negative reception by test audiences. There was apparently another antagonist who was completely removed, and different voice actors for some of the engines, among other differences. So the released version of the film was a pretty choppy end product. There has been a work print of the movie released online if you want to see what it would have been like originally. Even after the fact, the movie was a critical and commercial flop upon release. It only barely broke even at the box office. Looking over it, I do have to agree with most of the critics. As good as the show had been up to this point, this movie was stupid. In addition to the confusing storyline, the acting was all over the place, being too campy, too unconvincing, or too sullen, especially in the case of Peter Fonda. Not only that, but the human cast seemed to dominate the movie more than the engines. In a movie called Thomas and the Magic Railroad, you'd expect Thomas would play a dominant role in it, but his total on-screen time is only about 12 minutes out of the 84-minute runtime. The special effects were subpar, even for a movie made in the early 2000s. You can tell much of the acting was filmed on a green screen to have the effects added later. I also think that if they're going to give the engines different voice actors, they should have also given them the ability to move their mouths when they speak. It would have made Sodor a lot more lifelike and been an upgrade in quality from the TV show. It would have utilized the budget in a more meaningful way, you know? It was just an all-around subpar film. I'd say its score on Rotten Tomatoes was warranted, as was the consensus, which reads, "Kids these days demand cutting-edge special effects, or at least a clever plot with cute characters. This movie has neither, having lost in its Americanization what the British original did so right." There's a lot of pertinence in that statement. I'm going to take that and save it for later. I suppose this movie might have an ironic appeal in a so bad it's good kind of way, and it's okay if that's your reason for liking it. I guess it also made the presence of Thomas and his friends known to an even wider audience internationally, but its effect on the quality of the series was inescapable. With regards to Thomas the Tank Engine's on-screen persona, this is where the real decline started. Now, after Thomas and the Magic Railroad, I pretty much fell out of the loop with Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends. Whatever was going on between that movie and 2014 or 2015, I didn't pay attention to it. So I'm kind of going into these next several seasons a bit blind and only doing a basic overview on them. Bear with me. After the movie, Britt Allcroft stepped down from her post as head of the Britt Allcroft Company, and Ghislaine Entertainment became the name of the company producing Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends. Though she would remain a part of the production team as an executive producer and creative consultant for the following 2 seasons, her influence over the series was greatly reduced. Starting with season 6, the show employed a writing staff with director David Mitton helping to contribute story ideas, often creating an outline for the staff members to follow. This was done to hasten the production, as the show would be premiering a new season every year instead of there being a 2 or 3 year gap between each one. A quicker production schedule, as well as a new pack of writers, is bound to take a toll on any show's quality, and Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends was no exception. Episodes from seasons 6 and 7 were a bit duller in terms of storytelling compared with all previous ones. We started to get more exposition at the beginnings of episodes, and morals were spelled out more obviously rather than being subtly conveyed. Character personalities began to be dumbed down and weakened where they were once brave and, well, mature. Sometimes what happened in an episode went completely against previously established convention. So I guess Thomas doesn't need his snowplow then? We can just ignore the lesson from Thomas Terrence in the Snow? In fairness, some of the episodes are downright funny with how ridiculous they are, like Thomas and the Jet Engine and Gordon Takes a Tumble. Production values were also less polished. In season 6, it looks like all the daytime shots were lit by a couple huge fluorescent lights above the set. Season 7 had a lot of reused footage from old seasons. Between the two, I'd say season 7 was a bit better in terms of writing and production. Things looked a lot more colorful and dynamic here, and we got to see a multitude of different characters taking the spotlight. Season 6 also saw the genesis of a spin-off series with the Jack and the Pack episodes. A proper series never came to fruition, but 13 episodes were produced during Season 7's production and aired in 2006. Shame it didn't get picked up for a full series. I watched a few of these episodes, and some of them were downright hilarious.
"Oops," said Ned. "Hooray!" cheered the workmen. "Ouch!" said Oliver. "Ouch! Ouch! Ouch!" "Bust my buffers!" cried Thomas. "I'm loaded!"
Unfortunately, this would be the end of the line for classic Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends, which began to be called Thomas and Friends starting with Season 7. During production of this season, Ghislaine Entertainment was bought out by Hit Entertainment, and the new company began exercising their influence over the series. Accident scenes began to be toned down, and morals were becoming more blatantly stated. Clearly, Hit wanted a more child-friendly environment showcased on the island of Sodor. During this time, Britt Allcroft began focusing on other ventures in the United States and departed the series following production of this season. David Mitton, frustrated by the stifled creative freedom he now had with Hit's acquisition, was also gone. Other creative personnel also followed suit. and when Thomas and Friends returned to the airwaves in fall of 2004, it was on a very different track. Season 8 of Thomas and Friends brought us a repurposed and re-envisioned world on the island of Sodor. Thomas was back, but in a new way. Gone were the cameras that captured the engines at work on 35mm film. In their place were new digital cameras that captured everything in high definition. Episode runtimes were extended from 4.5 minutes to 7. The familiar theme tune from Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell was replaced by the engine roll call from Ed Welch and Robert Hartshorn, who also were the new composers for the incidental music starting here. The engine roll call gave us the names of the 8 engines who would be the main players on the show from here on out. Despite Duck being one of the 8 famous engines in the Audrey book of the same name, his role in the Steam team went to newcomer Emily, who had been introduced in the last season. Gotta have a female lead here, you know? Along with Duck, many of the other familiar faces that we'd come to know and love throughout the previous seasons went by the wayside. These engines were almost exclusively the leading stars for years. The focus of the stories was also changed. With its takeover of the series, Hit Entertainment desired to make the series more educational and focused on teaching morals. A recent discovery I came across in my research for this video was the Thomas and Friends Writer's Bible. This guide to the island of Sodor and the characters on it dictated the personalities and writing conventions for the episodes from this time period. Yeah, the Reverend Audrey made one of these, but that had been out of print for years at this point, and I doubt the showrunners would have utilized it anyway. Skimming through it revealed some odd protocols regarding characters and stories, which became all the more apparent in viewing the episodes from this time period. Several character bios gave strange details or retconned the engines in a way that was inconsistent with the events of the previous 7 seasons.
I'm sending you to Crew, a fine place for sick engines. They'll give you a new shape and a larger firebox. You'll feel a different engine and won't need special coal anymore. Won't that be nice?
It also saw the older engines as being weak and frail, in the case of Toby and Edward, or made them careless and childlike, in the case of Rheneas and Skarloey. Sir Handel somehow became the wise elder of the narrow-gauge engines. Quite a shift in personality from his cocky Season 4 persona. The engine crews also took on a lesser role so as to give the engines more volition. Most baffling of all was the section on age-appropriate language. Words such as furious, horrified, and hate were outlawed in favor of more soft language. If a word had more than one meaning in a different context, it was deemed unsuitable for the audience. Then it proceeded to give a long list of acceptable adjectives and color words to keep in mind. This is all tied together with learning objectives, episode templates, and what to keep in mind when making episodes of Thomas and Friends. Doesn't all of this sound thrilling? This is where Thomas and Friends started to look and sound more like a run-of-the-mill children's show. The lessons were now thrown at you like a pie in the face. Each episode would see a character learn something like being patient, or listening to others, or asking for help when you need it. There may have been a few other lessons in there too, like maybe what you're afraid of isn't so scary, but looking through these seasons, there wasn't much variety with these morals. Most of the time, episodes from these seasons featured a character doing something stupid, and out of character in many cases, until something went horribly wrong. Then they'd go back to do what they were supposed to have done in the first place, and later would state the lesson that they, and us by extension, were supposed to learn. There wasn't even much witty dialogue as there had been with the Britt Allcroft and David Mitten years. All the episodes from seasons 8 through 11 just felt virtually identical to one another. I guess season 11 looks a little more polished with the dimmer lighting that's in it, but that's really the only aesthetic change I saw. No wonder Michael Angelis sounded so bored here.
Thomas cheered loudest of all.
It wasn't just the episodes that enforced learning on the audience. With the new half-hour block in which episodes aired, there were these little interstitial segments between episodes which were meant to teach kids more things like where Henry can find his special coal, figuring out if Thomas is happy or sad, or seeing what makes Thomas different from Percy. These thoroughly dispensable segments just reinforce the watered-down nature of the series here. It's particularly egregious in the Calling All Engines DVD movie from 2005. Every few minutes or so, the main story is interrupted by one of these segments, or by a song that doesn't tell us anything we don't know already. Calling All Engines had a decent story involving the power struggle between the steam engines and diesels, and if the producers had left it at that, this could have been an okay film, but no. To be fair, I think the producers realized Calling All Engines got a bit bogged down by all those interruptions to the story. The next film, The Great Discovery, only utilized songs as part of the feature, and they actually did help move the plot along. It also featured a guest narrator in Pierce Brosnan, who temporarily took over the role from Michael Angelis, who was the UK narrator since Season 3, and Michael Brandon, the US narrator since Season 7. Apparently he was supposed to be the new narrator for the show starting here, but the deal fell through. This movie was the only time Brosnan lent his voice to the famous tank engine and his friends. If only there were more James Bond references here, that would have made this otherwise mediocre film a little more pleasing. The Great Discovery would be the last full production made the way Thomas and Friends had been produced since the 80s. By 2008, the upkeep of the models and sets was becoming costly. The cheaper alternative was to utilize CGI for the series. This was partially done in Season 12. Although the model engines were still used, they now had CGI faces, which finally allowed the engines the ability to move their mouths when they spoke. All the human figures were replaced by CG figures. It was pretty cool to see this hybridized look of the series. Even though it does look a little dated now, it brought more life to the characters in a way that was not possible before. This was sort of a send-off for the model era, as many characters, including some that had not been seen in half a decade, made appearances in episodes. For some of these characters, this would be their final bow. After Season 12, all the engine models and figures were boxed up and put away, never to be seen again. On the TV series, that is. Most of the models have been preserved and put on display in places like Drayton Manor in the UK or the Hara Museum in Japan. Some props have also made it into the collections of fans, such as Thomas Tank merch. So, despite being relics of the past, the model years of Thomas and Friends are not forgotten. Now we get into the CGI era. The 2009 film Hero of the Rails brought the new look to us for the first time, courtesy of Nitrogen Studios. Now, a change in production style like this has the potential to look uncanny, especially if the character's appearance is drastically changed. However, in rendering Thomas in CGI, I think Nitrogen Studios did a pretty good job. The CG renderings of the characters look nice, and in some cases they actually look better than they did as models. There are also more dynamics available with the use of CGI that were never possible in the model series. We can get a view from beneath the engines as they pass over the camera, and weather can be simulated more realistically. You can also get shots like these, where parts come off of an engine as they're in motion. Overall, I think the advent of CGI made things better for Thomas. Now, with the upgrade in technology, what would we get for stories? Would there be more exhilarating chase scenes? Would there be a shift in tone to make the series more dramatic or poignant?
Hello, Mr. Bird! I'm Percy! Would you like to be friends with me?
Nope, it was just more of the same crap as before, only now I'd argue it got even worse. Instead of more action and intelligent writing, we got stories where the engines did things like playing in mud puddles, helping children make snowmen, or making friends with woodland creatures. Yeah, despite looking better than it had before, the first years of Thomas and Friends in CGI were weak, which is a pity considering Hero of the Rails was one of the better Thomas and Friends movies. On a side note, direct-to-DVD movies from Thomas and Friends happened between every season for about 10 years, starting with The Great Discovery. I'm not going to talk very much about them here. Mainly they serve to introduce us to new characters, reintroduce old ones we hadn't seen in a while, or show off new locations that appear in subsequent episodes. Unless they coincide with a change to the show's formula, they won't be discussed. Back to these first CGI seasons. It really feels like they just threw the episodes from each season together in a single afternoon. The stories were formulaic, repetitive, and in many cases they made no sense. The actions of the engines over the course of episodes made you question whether the really useful label was still appropriate here. You could pretty much describe every single plot as being Engine X does something wrong 3 times before realizing their mistake and doing it right. The scripts were also lazily written. Listen to how many times alliteration and rhyming is used in a single episode and you'll lose your mind. I could only sit through about 3 episodes of this before I had to stop and gather what was left of my dignity. These seasons represented the lowest point for Thomas and Friends yet. I know that this show is intended for very young children, but I think kids above the age of 2 would be falling asleep to these episodes with how dull they are. Overall, the less said about this period of Thomas and Friends, the better. But it wasn't the permanent state of things, because we got another change in ownership. In 2012, Hit Entertainment was purchased by Mattel, and we got some more changes. Most notable was the change in writing staff. For season 17, Thomas and Friends got a new head writer in Andrew Brenner, who had previously written for the Thomas and Friends magazine. Remember, the ones whose stories were adapted for the 3rd and 5th seasons? Now we got a guy who really knew Thomas and sought to bring the show back to its roots. The result? A much-needed upgrade in the show's quality. No more reliance on rhyming and alliteration ad nauseum, and quite a reduction in sheer incompetence from the engines. We got to see stories that felt more like they were plausible on a real railway again. It was a real night and day difference from what we had before. Watching episodes from seasons 17 to 21 didn't make me feel like I was losing vital brain cells. From season to season, it just got better. In season 20, they even went as far as to adapt some of the Reverend's original stories for the first time in decades, retelling the stories from Thomas the Tank Engine for a special, and adapting the stories from the Small Railway Engines book. Now that shows some real dedication and passion for the source material. While the tone for these seasons may not have been the same as it had been for the early seasons, it proved that it was possible to appeal to today's children and still maintain the spirit of the original Railway series books. Seasons 17 through 21 were the peak years for CGI Thomas, just as seasons 1 through 5 were the peak years for the model era. The showrunners really ended the show on a high note with these final seasons. Oh, if only I could say that if these were the final seasons. But in 2018, we got this. So, in yet another direct-to-DVD film, Thomas gets the opportunity to see the world, something he's wanted to do ever since his introduction.
I'm tired of pushing coaches. I want to see the world.
Well, assuming he wanted to travel the entire globe to follow a Lightning McQueen knockoff as he races on different continents from that statement is a bit of a stretch. But we're not strictly following the Railway series anymore now, are we? This kickstarted another big change for the series. Now it was rebranded as Thomas and Friends Big World, Big Adventures for seasons 22 through 24. And we got some big changes here. First were the visuals. There was yet another changeover in Animation Studio, and a subsequent change in style. Not only can the engines visibly move their mouths when they speak, they can also move around on their frames. This was first done sparingly in Season 21, but in Big World, Big Adventures, barely a scene goes by without seeing the engines springing into action. Sorry. Clearly, another tactic gleaned from the Cars franchise. This gimmick gets rather distracting and irritating with its overuse. But that's not all. We now get fantasy sequences throughout the episodes where the engines can do all kinds of wild things that no locomotive could possibly do. What is going into the fireboxes here? There's way too much on-screen activity to comprehend or discuss. Let's just look at the concept behind this new version of Thomas and Friends. These seasons were a mix of adventures on Sodor and adventures around the world by Thomas. who serves as the narrator now. Sorry, Mark Morahan. Half the episodes from each season saw Thomas in a different nation. He could be pulling passengers in China, trying to spot tigers in India, or at Carnival in Brazil. Okay, so Thomas is taking time to show us different things about other countries. Just one question. Why is he in those places? In the movie he was following Ace, but Ace only appears in one other episode afterward. So I don't think these stories are taking place at the same time as the Big World, Big Adventures movie. Watching through these, I never heard an explanation for why Thomas was in these countries. He's just there working. This was done as a marketing ploy on Mattel's part to showcase Thomas in countries where he may not have been as popular as he was in the UK or US. Although, Australia was among the earliest nations to air the series back in the 80s, so the inclusion of that nation in Thomas's travels is a bit of a mystery. He meets lots of other people and engines here, not just around the world, but on the island of Sodor as well. For this new iteration of Thomas and Friends, there was a shakeup in the core cast of characters. 2 new female steam engines were introduced to the main cast, and 2 males were dropped. Well, 3, I guess, since Toby doesn't really seem to be here anymore. This was done in order to have more equality between genders. The first newcomer was Nia, a tank engine from Kenya that Thomas met in Big World, Big Adventures. She replaces Edward, who has now relocated to Wellsworth Station. The second newcomer was Rebecca, a locomotive brought in to take Henry's place when he decided to relocate to Vickerstown Sheds. Okay, we need to ask a serious question here. How many characters does this show need? In every season, it seems like we get at least one new engine on Sir Topham Hatt's railway. It was already difficult to keep track of the ones from the books, but the TV show has added dozens more to supplant them. Counting up all the engines, vehicles, and humans that have appeared in this show gave me a rough total of over 400 characters. That's insane! I don't think there's any other preschool show with a cast that massive, and not all of these characters have a constant presence in the show either. Of course, Thomas and almost everyone who appeared with him in the first season has been around pretty consistently, but not all the engines introduced in subsequent seasons have been so lucky. Several times, I've noticed that a new character will be introduced, then they appear in only 1 or 2 episodes of a season and are never shown again afterwards. It kind of feels like a waste. I tend to not pay attention to the non-Audrey characters on the show. Most of them are either pretty similar in demeanor to engines we've seen already, or there's not that much about them that really piques my interest. There are also several annoying ones around, too.
Oh, it was such fun when you stayed the night at my shed.
Meet Scrappy-Doo in locomotive form. Sure, there are some exceptions here and there, but by and large, most of the new characters introduced after Season 7 feel redundant. You have to ask yourself, is there any real value to having them here? Anything besides that? Look, I'm not here to knock the toys or any other Thomas and Friends merchandise. I don't think it's inherently bad, for the most part. Of course, when I was in the target age group for the show, I had lots of Thomas and Friends stuff, toys included. The wooden trains, the die-cast ones, and miscellaneous others. For young children, having a toy in the likeness of their favorite character can feel like having a piece of that world with them, and give them a sense of comfort. It's natural to have this feeling. The Reverend Audrey himself even created a toy likeness of Thomas the Tank Engine for his son Christopher before the show was ever conceived. Toys go a long way in making a connection with the audience. The problem is that when a show or movie owes a lot of its success to toy sales, it can lead the showrunners to make many decisions that revolve around boosting the sales. That's where I think the show's quality starts to suffer. A television show for kids needs to do more than just be a marketing tool for toys. If you decide to add a new character, that character needs to have a well-defined, unique personality that makes them worth being there. So what about Nia and Rebecca? What do they add to the world of Thomas and Friends? Well, Nia's from Africa, and she seems to be a kind and understanding engine who works hard. That kind of sounds a lot like the personality of Edward, or Emily, or a lot of older characters, well, minus the thing about being from Africa. By the way, do you think they made it clear enough that she's from Africa? I couldn't really tell.
I met plenty of elephants back home in Kenya.
Now what about Rebecca? She's sort of clumsy and scatterbrained, but again, she's a hard worker. That might actually be a more unique temperament. I don't think we've seen a character like her. Oh, wait. Yeah, we have. Dozens of times. Boy, it sounds like replacing Edward and Henry with these two was kind of a bad idea, wasn't it? This perfectly exemplifies what I was just saying. A new character needs to be new, not just in terms of appearance, but in terms of qualities. Thinking of what Edward and Henry have been through in their times on the show, overcoming serious accidents, carrying on in dire circumstances, etc., Nia and Rebecca just don't stack up. The stories in which they have lead roles are really nothing special. Actually, some of the stories that take place on Sodor just feel bizarre and gimmicky, and not just because of the fantasy sequences I already talked about. A few episodes feel like they don't even belong in a show about talking trains. I mean, we got an episode where James imagines he's a superhero, and then another one where Thomas tries to convince the other engines that he's not in love with Rosie. What? Did the writers run across fan fiction online and just adapt those into episodes? Because that's what these stories sound like. Something you'd run across on the internet from people who aren't taking the show seriously. Yeah, the early CGI seasons had outrageous stories as well, but at least those didn't have wince-worthy fantasy sequences or have the engines bouncing around every 5 seconds. Was Big World, Big Adventures worse than seasons 13 through 16? Not really. There are still some good episodes here and there whose quality wasn't too far off from seasons 17 through 21. However, this era of Thomas and Friends suffers from trying to do too many things to please everyone. It has too much going on visually, and with splitting the setting up between Sodor and the international locations, it struggles to stay focused. It feels less like a real railway and more like an animated children's playset much of the time. How embarrassing that this was the way Thomas and Friends ended its original run after more than 3 decades on television. Yep, the Big World, Big Adventures era of the show was not as successful as the showrunners had hoped, and that pretty much scuppered the series. There was nothing left to do except
Reboot it, renew it, reshoot it, redo it.
Which brings us to this. So this is Thomas now, a 2-dimensional cartoon character with a 1-dimensional personality. He talks and acts like a hyperactive 5-year-old, as do several of the other characters. Few members of the original cast, aside from Thomas, Percy, Gordon, and a few others appear. In fact, most of the new characters introduced in Big World, Big Adventures are absent. Realism is now completely abandoned, as the characters can do things like jump around between tracks and use their wheels like arms and legs. Again, this feels like what you'd see children doing when playing with toy trains, not what would be happening on a real railway. It just goes to show you how far the series has fallen, having lost in its Americanization what the British original did so right. Now, where have I heard that before? Oh yeah, the criticisms that were made against Thomas and the Magic Railroad are the exact same ones that can be made against this. This has none of the charm, wit, or intelligent writing that made the original Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends series worth watching. This is just what you'd put on to keep kids quiet for a period of time while you do something else. Why is this irritating to me? I mean, it's just for little kids. Well, I think kids deserve a bit more than just non-stop visual and auditory stimulation, which is what a lot of preschool entertainment tends to be these days. Stories that they see on television or have read to them can impact them and help shape them into adults. They have the ability to talk to them without talking down to them. The characters who are part of these stories can connect with children through the experiences they have. There's a lot that can be done and has been done through Thomas the Tank Engine and his friends over the years, and this just squanders it. All Engines Go isn't really harmful to kids, but Years down the road, supposing children are exposed to more of the original Thomas and Friends, how will it hold up against what came before? I still think the original series holds up very well. As an adult, I can appreciate the craftsmanship that was put forth to make the episodes. Outside of fan recreations online, I don't think we'll ever get to see something like the first 5 seasons of Thomas and Friends ever again. The children's entertainment marketplace has changed so much. We're sadly left with this haphazard cardboard reproduction of him now. If you like All Engines Go, I won't hold anything against you, but I will say that the concept of a bouncy, energetic railway which isn't really concerned with realism isn't anything new. Chuggington, which premiered around the time Thomas and Friends made the transition to CGI, was already doing this, and in my opinion, it does it a lot better. Sure, it still looks a bit outlandish, but the characters seem to exhibit a bit more self-restraint with their actions and voices, from what I saw of it. So I'd say this is the best alternative to All Engines Go. As for me, I'm going to stick with the classic Thomas, the one that felt the most real in terms of character. Maybe he's not for everyone, but he's the most genuine, and the one that shouldn't be forgotten. For being a big part of many a childhood, including mine, this is the Thomas the Tank Engine that can properly be considered really useful.